There is a town in central Pennsylvania where the street lamps are shaped like wrapped sweets. The two principal avenues are named after the countries where cocoa grows. There is a park, a rose garden, a theater with a ceiling painted to look like a Mediterranean sky at night, an ice rink, a hotel on the hill with a dining room built without a single supporting column because the man paying for it did not want anybody seated behind a post, and a factory. On certain still afternoons, if the wind comes off the works in the right direction, the air in the streets genuinely smells of chocolate. None of it grew. It was not a settlement that developed a factory. It was a factory that was given a settlement, laid out in advance on a map, in the middle of a landscape that in 1903 consisted almost entirely of cornfields, dairy farms, and a crossroads with a church. And the man who drew that map and paid for every inch of it had no children, no brother, no sister, and no heir of any kind. That is the fact this whole story turns on. In the ordinary run of these accounts, and this channel has told a great many of them, a fortune is assembled by one generation to be handed to the next, and the interest lies in what the next generation does with it. The marriages, the litigation, the country houses, the slow dissolution over 3 generations into a name on a hospital wing. Here there was no next generation. There was a man of 61 who had built one of the most profitable manufacturing businesses in the United States and had absolutely nobody to leave it to. What he did about that is the reason anybody still talks about him. His name was Milton Hershey, and until he was almost 30, he was, by every standard his own family applied, a failure. This channel makes documentaries on the great dynasties of old money, how they were built, how they were spent, and what remained when the last of the family had gone. Subscribe for a new episode every week. There is a version of this story that is told in the town itself and on the wrappers and in the museum. And it is not false so much as incomplete. It has the failures in it, and the wife, and the school, and it stops there, in a warm glow. What it leaves out is the part that makes the man interesting rather than merely admirable. That a town owned entirely by one person is a strange place to live, even when the person is kind. That the sugar which made the chocolate was grown on estates, worked under conditions he did not examine closely. And that in the spring of 1937, the men in his own factory sat down at their machines and the town he had built came apart in a week. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. That is generally how it works. He was born on the 13th of September, 1857, on a farm in Derry Township, in the rolling limestone country of central Pennsylvania, into a Mennonite family descended from Swiss and German people who had come over in the 1700s. The first language in the house was the German dialect that everyone in that part of the state then spoke. His mother was Veronica Snavely, called Fanny, and she was the practical one, devout, unsentimental, hardworking, from a family that had been farming the same ground for generations. His father was Henry Hershey, and he was the other thing entirely. Henry was a man of schemes. He had ideas about oil, and about a nursery business, and about various inventions, and about opportunities in other towns. And none of them ever came to anything, and the family moved constantly in pursuit of them. Between his birth and his adolescence, Milton attended something like 7 different schools. The moving was why the education stopped at the 4th grade, and the absence of that education was something he remained self-conscious about for the whole of his very long life. There was one sister. Serena was born in the spring of 1862, and she died in 1867 at 4 years old. After that, Milton was an only child, and his mother had a particular kind of attention to give him, and the marriage between his parents effectively ended, though they never formally separated, and Henry drifted in and out for decades. It is worth holding those two people side by side, because the son turned out to be both of them at once. He had his father's appetite for the enormous, unlikely project: build a town, build a railway, build a school for 1,000 children, and his mother's absolute refusal to stop working on it after the excitement had gone. Almost nobody gets both. Henry Hershey, without Fanny Snavely, produced nothing at all in 70 years. The combination of the two of them in one person produced Hershey, Pennsylvania. At 14, he was apprenticed to a printer at a German-language newspaper in a small town near Lancaster. He was dismissed within a few months. The story told about it afterwards was that he dropped his hat into the press, though whether that is what actually happened, no document confirms. What is not in dispute is that he lost the job. His mother arranged the next one, and it turned out to be the whole of his life. He was apprenticed to a confectioner in Lancaster who ran an ice cream parlor, and for 4 years he waited tables, washed dishes, made deliveries, and was gradually taught the trade. Sugar temperatures, boiling, pulling, molding, the physics of what happens to sucrose at 240 degrees and what happens at 260. It is a craft, and he had a hand for it. At 19, in 1876, he borrowed money from his mother's relatives and opened his own shop in Philadelphia. The reasoning was sound. It was the centennial year of American independence. The great exhibition was in the city, and the crowds would be enormous. He worked by his own later account brutal hours, with his mother and an aunt helping at night wrapping sweets. It failed. It took 6 years to fail, which is in some ways worse than failing quickly. He went to Denver next, where his father had drifted, and there he learned the single most valuable thing he ever learned from anybody, which was how to make caramels with fresh milk rather than with the paste that Eastern confectioners used. It produced a chewier sweet with a longer shelf life. He filed it away and moved on to Chicago, to New Orleans, and then to New York, where in 1883 he opened another business. That one lasted 3 years and failed as well, and this time the failure was total. He could not pay to have his own possessions shipped back to Lancaster. He walked out to his uncle's farm to ask for help, and what he found there is the detail that explains a great deal about the rest of his life. Most of the family would not receive him. He was, in their assessment, a drifter, and his father's son, and they had seen this before. He was 28. He had spent 12 years and other people's money on 3 businesses and had nothing. What happened next happened because 2 people did not give up on him. His mother came, again, with money she did not have, and so did her sister. And a man named Harry Lebkitcher, who had worked for him in Philadelphia and had watched that business die, put in what he had and then came to work for him for nothing, keeping the books and living in the same rooms, and stayed at Milton Hershey's side for the next 40 years. Old Lebby, everyone in the town called him, and there is a street named after him in it now. They started again in Lancaster in a single small room. He made caramels with fresh milk, the Denver method, and sold them from a push cart. And then the thing that never happened in Philadelphia or Chicago or New York happened here. An English importer tasted them and placed a very large order for export to Britain. That order was the hinge. He borrowed against it, bought machinery, hired people, and within a few years the small room had become a factory running the length of a city block. The Lancaster Caramel Company employed hundreds. By his middle 30s, Milton Hershey was, for the first time, a rich man, and the relatives who had shut the door on him revised their opinion, as relatives do. He might have stopped there. Caramel was a good business. What happened instead was the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. Among the machinery on display was a set of German chocolate-making equipment, the roasters, the conches, the molding apparatus. Chocolate in America in 1893 was a luxury, imported or made in small quantities, and above all it was dark. Milk chocolate, the soft, sweet, pale brown thing that a Swiss manufacturer had worked out how to make in the 1870s, was essentially a European product, protected by a process that the Swiss guarded closely and that nobody in America had reproduced. He stood in front of the machines and, according to the account he gave afterwards, told his companion that caramels were a fad but chocolate was permanent. He bought the entire exhibit on the spot and had it shipped to Lancaster. For the next several years, he ran a chocolate operation as a subsidiary of the Caramel Works, and he did something that would look reckless in any modern company. He set out to reverse engineer the Swiss process by trial and error, with no chemist, no formula, and no idea what the variables were. Milk chocolate is genuinely difficult. Milk is mostly water, and water and chocolate are enemies. The milk has to be reduced and combined at particular temperatures in a particular order, or the result seizes or spoils or tastes of nothing. It took years. The formula that eventually emerged was not the Swiss one. It was an American variant with its own distinct flavor, slightly sour, produced by a step in the treatment of the milk. And it is the reason that to this day, American milk chocolate tastes to a European palate like a different substance altogether. He did not invent that flavor on purpose. He arrived at it, kept it, and an entire nation grew up thinking that is what chocolate tastes like. In 1900, he made the decision that everyone around him thought was madness. He sold the Lancaster Caramel Company, the profitable, established, safe business, for $1 million and kept only the chocolate machinery and the right to go on making chocolate in the same building. He was 43 years old, he had been solvent for barely a decade, and he had just converted the whole of it into a bet on a product almost nobody in America was buying. 2 years earlier, he had done something equally unlikely. He met Catherine Sweeney in New York State on a sales trip. She was a shop girl, 26 years old, born in Jamestown to Irish immigrant parents, who had left high school in her final year to go out to work and help support her family. She was quick, funny, warm, and extremely good at making a room notice her. He was 40, unmarried, awkward, uneducated, and had spent his entire adult life in a factory. They courted for about a year, largely by letter, and on the 25th of May, 1898, they were married in New York City. Almost nobody was told in advance. There were reasons for the discretion. She was an Irish Catholic. His mother was a strict Mennonite. The two women did not warm to one another, and never entirely did. And for the whole of the marriage, there was a low, permanent friction in the household about it that everybody managed politely and nobody resolved. What is striking, given how these arrangements usually went, is that the marriage itself appears to have been genuinely happy. Every surviving account agrees on it. He brought her flowers every day of their life together. This is in the record from more than one source, and it is such a small and unglamorous habit that nobody would have bothered to invent it. She brought into an existence that had consisted of nothing but work the entire category of pleasure: travel, clothes, gardens, conversation, Europe, Egypt, the theater. They went round the world. She spent his money with an enjoyment he seems to have found delightful rather than alarming, which for a self-made Mennonite manufacturer of that generation is close to remarkable. They wanted children. They did not have them. Her health from early in the marriage was not right. That is the whole of the private material, and it is not much, and the reason it matters is that everything he built afterwards was built into the space where the children were not. The chocolate factory needed milk. Milk cannot travel far in 1903 before it turns. The entire American dairy industry of that period was organized around the distance a churn could go in a morning. If you are going to make milk chocolate on an industrial scale, the factory has to stand in the middle of the cows. So in 1903, having sold the caramel business and looked at a good deal of the eastern United States, Milton Hershey went back to the place he had been born, in Dairy Township, in the middle of some of the best dairy land in Pennsylvania, and began to build a factory in a cornfield. There was no town there. There was a crossroads, a church, a few farms, and a railway line. Local people thought he had lost his mind, and the site was referred to for a while, not affectionately, as Hershey's Folly. The factory opened in 1905. What went up around it over the following decade is the part that has no real parallel in American industry. What was being made inside the building deserves a moment, because the entire town rests on it and almost nobody thinks about it. Chocolate begins as a seed in a pod on a tree that grows only in a narrow band either side of the equator. The seeds are fermented, dried, shipped, roasted, cracked, winnowed, and then ground. And because the seed is around half fat by weight, grinding it does not produce a powder, but a thick, dark liquid. That liquid is the raw material of everything. Add sugar and it is dark chocolate. Add milk and you have the problem that occupied Milton Hershey for the best part of a decade. The difficulty is water. Milk is mostly water, and water in molten chocolate makes it seize into a stiff, granular ruin. The Swiss solution had been to reduce the milk to a paste first and combine it under carefully managed conditions, and the details were closely held. What emerged in Pennsylvania was a different route to the same place. The milk was treated in a way that broke down some of the fat before it ever reached the chocolate, which stabilized it and made it keep, and which also introduced a faint, sour, slightly cheesy note that a European taster identifies instantly and finds unpleasant. Americans did not find it unpleasant. Americans had almost no basis for comparison, and by the time they did, 2 generations had been raised on it, and that flavor had become the definition of what chocolate is. Whether the effect was intended or simply the byproduct of a process that worked, no document settles. Either way, it is one of the more consequential accidents in the history of food. Then there was the grinding. The finished liquid was worked for hours in machines that rolled and folded it, driving off moisture and reducing the particles until the mixture stopped feeling gritty on the tongue. That process has a name, conching, from the shell shape of the original machine, and it is the difference between confectionery and sand. The commercial decision on top of all this was the one that actually built the town. He priced the bar at 5 cents and held it there. Not approximately 5 cents. 5 cents for the better part of 70 years, through 2 world wars, in a depression, in the collapse of the currency's purchasing power. When costs rose, the company did not raise the price. It made the bar smaller. When costs fell, it made the bar bigger again. Employees and salesmen tracked the fluctuations for decades, and the size of a 5-cent Hershey bar in any given year is now a usable index of American commodity prices. The effect of that policy was that the product was permanently within reach of a child with a coin, which is a category of customer that does not disappear in a recession and does not shop on price because there is no price to compare. It is also why the company sailed through the 1930s, while the rest of American manufacturing was on its knees. In 1907, he added a small conical piece of solid chocolate wrapped in foil and named it himself, and the name he chose was based on the sound the machine made as it deposited each one on the belt. It has been in continuous production ever since. None of the day-to-day commerce was run by him for very long. A young salesman who had come to him in the caramel days took over as president of the chocolate company in 1908 and held the position for nearly 40 years. Through the whole of the growth, the whole of the depression, and the whole of the strike, Hershey built the town, the school, the railway in Cuba, and the hotel with no column. The salesman sold the chocolate. It was, by every account, one of the more successful working partnerships in American industry, and the man's name is on nothing. He did not build a mill village. Mill villages existed by the hundred all over the eastern states, and they were mostly wretched. Rows of identical company houses, rented from the employer, in a settlement with a company store selling on credit at the company's prices, frequently with a fence and a gate. When work ended, housing ended. When wages were cut, rent was not. What Hershey laid out instead was a town with a plan. Wide streets on a grid with trees. A public trolley system, which he paid for, connecting the factory to the surrounding villages so that men could live where they chose and come into work. An arrangement that quietly destroys the whole logic of a company town, because a worker who can commute is a worker who can leave. A public school, a bank, a department store, a free library, a park with gardens, a zoo, and eventually an amusement ground. A community building with a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a hospital and a theater in it, sewers, water, electric light. And the houses were sold, not rented. He put up money to help employees buy them, and he varied the design so that the streets did not look like a barracks. And once a man owned his house, it was his, and stayed his if he lost his job. He named the 2 main streets Chocolate Avenue and Cocoa Avenue, which is the single most literal act of civic naming in the history of the United States. And he named the cross streets after the places the beans came from: Trinidad, Caracas, Java, Ceylon, Aruba. A man with a 4th-grade education in a Pennsylvania cornfield gave his neighbors a street map of the tropics. He was not working without a model. The idea of the industrial village built by a manufacturer for moral as well as commercial reasons was a Victorian one, and the specific example he had looked at was English, the settlement the Cadbury brothers had laid out beside their own chocolate works outside Birmingham, with its cottages and gardens and playing fields, built by Quakers who believed that the physical conditions of a life determined the moral quality of it. Hershey knew about it, and the resemblance is not accidental. The counterexample was in Illinois, and everybody in American industry knew about that one too. A railway car manufacturer had built a town south of Chicago in the 1880s, which was, by the standards of the day, magnificent. Brick houses, indoor plumbing, a theater, a library, parks. He also owned every building in it, set the rents, prohibited independent newspapers, banned alcohol, and employed inspectors to enter the houses. When the Depression of 1893 came, he cut wages and did not cut rents, and the strike that followed had to be ended by federal troops, and a commission afterwards described the whole arrangement as un-American. It was the standing demonstration that a model town could be a beautiful cage. Hershey's town avoided the worst of that deliberately, and it is worth being precise about how. Employees owned their homes. There was no company scrip. There was no fence and no gate. The trolley meant nobody was captive. The school was a public school run by the township. Alcohol he did discourage, being his mother's son, but he did not police it in the manner of Illinois. And yet, it was still a town in which one man owned the factory that employed nearly everybody, the bank that held their savings, the store where they shopped, the trolley they rode, the park they took their children to on Sunday, and the theater where they were entertained on Saturday. He decided what got built. He decided where the streets went. He walked around the place daily, into the factory, into the shops, talking to everyone, and he knew an extraordinary number of his workers by name. And the flip side of a proprietor who knows your name is a proprietor who knows a good deal else about you and whose executives know it too. Hiring and firing in that town could and did turn on matters that in a normal city would have been nobody's business. Nobody was oppressed. Everybody was, in a way that is hard to articulate and was articulated with great force in 1937, obliged. That is the honest description of a benevolent company town, and the people who lived in this one seem largely to have accepted the trade, because the alternative available to a Pennsylvania factory hand in 1912 was substantially worse in every measurable respect. But it was a trade, and it was made with a man rather than with an institution, and men die. Which is precisely the problem he and his wife sat down to solve in 1909. They had been married 11 years. It was by then settled that there would be no children. And what they did about it was not what people in their position normally did, which was to leave the money to nephews, or to a church, or to a museum with the family name over the door. On the 15th of November, 1909, Milton and Catherine Hershey signed a deed of trust establishing the Hershey Industrial School. They transferred into it the farm on which he had been born, the homestead, together with something in the order of 486 acres of land and everything standing on it. The income from the property was to support the school in perpetuity. Two things about that document deserve emphasis. The first is that she signed it with him as an equal party at a time when a married woman's involvement in the disposal of her husband's property was not merely unusual, but in most states legally complicated. Whenever the subject came up afterwards, for the remaining 36 years of his life, he said the same sentence, that it was Kitty's idea. He said it publicly, repeatedly, and there is no obvious advantage to him in having said it. Historians of the institution have generally taken him at his word. The second is the specification. The school was for orphan boys, initially in the original terms, white boys who had lost their fathers, a restriction that reflected the ordinary assumptions of 1909 and which the trust would eventually be taken to court over and made to change, and which it is dishonest to skip past. They were to be admitted young, housed in family-sized groups in farmhouses with married couples acting as house parents rather than in a barracks, fed properly, given a full academic education alongside agricultural and vocational training, and kept until they were grown. The first boys arrived in 1910. There were 4 of them. They lived in the farmhouse where he had been born, and Catherine Hershey involved herself in the details of the thing with an energy that surprised people. The menus, the clothing, the manners, what a boy ought to be taught about how to behave at a table. Every year she had them all up to the mansion on the hill for breakfast. There is a photograph from 1912 of Catherine and her mother-in-law, the Irish Catholic and the Mennonite, who did not like each other, sitting together in the garden of that house surrounded by the school's boys. And it is the single most eloquent object in the entire archive. The first 2 decades of that school are worth describing concretely because the phrase school for orphan boys conjures something Victorian and grim. And this was not that, and it was also not a holiday. A boy arrived young, sometimes at 4 or 5 years old, generally after his father had died and his mother had found she could not keep the household together. He was placed not in a dormitory but in a farmhouse, one of a series of them scattered across the estate, with a married couple living there as house parents and a set of brothers of assorted ages around the table. That structure was deliberate. It came out of Milton Hershey's insistence, and it is still the model the school uses. The days were long, the estate was a working agricultural operation, and the boys worked it. There was milking before breakfast, and milking again in the evening, and animals to be fed and fields to be cleared, and then a full academic day in between, and then homework, and then bed. Nobody has ever pretended this was gentle. Graduates writing about it decades later tend to use the same 2 words in the same sentence, which are hard and grateful. What they got in exchange was, by the standards of an orphaned, working-class child in 1920 in the United States, close to unimaginable. 3 meals a day, every day. A doctor and a dentist, clothes that fitted, a bed of one's own in a heated house. A full secondary education at a time when most American children did not finish one, and a trade alongside it, and a small sum of money and a set of clothes on the way out, and in many cases help with college afterwards. The alternative in that decade was the county home, or the street, or a farm placement that was frequently indistinguishable from indenture. And the founder was constantly present. This is the part that comes through most strongly in the accounts left by the men who went through it. He had no children, and he lived, for the last 15 years of his life, in a small apartment directly above the school's offices, and he walked out among them, and he knew names, and he turned up at the farms and at meals and at the graduations, and he took a personal and slightly awkward interest in individual boys that was noticed by all of them. When he was in his 80s, there were students who had been brought to that school as infants and had never known any other adult in that role. He was, in the most literal available sense, a man who had converted a fortune into a family and then went and sat in the middle of it. By then, she could no longer walk unaided. The illness had begun early in the marriage and had gone on getting worse. It was progressive. It affected her nervous system. It took her balance and then her mobility. And the doctors of 2 continents never conclusively established what it was. A contemporary described it as a kind of creeping paralysis and said that she was extremely plucky about it and never allowed anyone around her to feel awkward. In the last year, she traveled to Europe repeatedly to see specialists and take the waters at spas, and none of it helped. They went on traveling anyway, which is the detail that says most about the 2 of them. There is a photograph taken at the pyramids at Giza in the spring of 1913. He is standing, she is seated in the car, and they are both looking at the camera, and she is by that stage barely able to stand at all, and they had come to Egypt. In the spring of 1912, they had booked a crossing home from Europe. He had put down a deposit for a first-class stateroom on the maiden voyage of a new White Star liner, and the copy of the check he wrote to the shipping line still exists in a museum in Pennsylvania. In the event, business at the factory required him back sooner, and they canceled and sailed instead on a German ship a few days earlier. The story is usually told with Kitty's illness as the reason for the cancellation, which is a better story and is not true. She had been ill for years by then, and it had nothing to do with the booking. The reason was chocolate. Somewhere in the North Atlantic in the April of 1912, a great many fortunes, rather larger than his, went down in the small hours, and the Hersheys were 4 days ahead of it, on another ship, because a factory manager had sent a telegram about production. By the end of 1914, she was almost entirely incapacitated. When the doctors told her there was nothing further they could do, she turned to Christian Science, which is what people did. In the March of 1915, they were in Philadelphia. He came in to see her. She greeted him and asked for a glass of champagne, and he went out himself personally rather than sending anyone to fetch it. When he came back into the room, she was dead. She was 43 years old. He had not understood how close it was. She had known it darkly for some time and had told nobody, which was entirely consistent with the way she had conducted the whole of her illness. The funeral was 2 days later. He gave every employee in the factory the day off and paid for a train to take anyone who wished to go to Philadelphia for the service. She was buried eventually in the cemetery on the hill above the town. Her roses were moved to the gardens he later built. For years afterwards, he would have himself driven there in the afternoon and would sit for a while among them and then go back to work. He was 57. He lived for another 30 years and never remarried, and carried her photograph with him for the rest of his life. 3.5 years later, he did the thing that this documentary exists to describe. The circumstances were not calm. There was a war on. Sugar, which is the largest single ingredient in milk chocolate by weight, had become a strategic commodity and was rationed and controlled. The chocolate company had been placed in a position where its raw material supply was subject to the decisions of a government board. And Milton Hershey was 61 years old with no wife, no children, no siblings, and a mother in her 80s. On the 13th of November, 1918, he executed a deed transferring almost the entire remainder of his personal fortune into the trust that supported the school. Not a bequest, not a foundation to be established on his death. An outright irrevocable transfer made while he was alive and in full health of his property and of the controlling block of shares in the Hershey Chocolate Company. From that moment, the school owned the company. Not the other way around. He told nobody. There was no announcement, no press release, no ceremony. He continued to run the business exactly as before, living in the same house, working the same hours. The public did not learn what he had done until 1923, 5 years later, when a newspaper worked it out, and by then the value of what he had signed away had grown considerably. When he was eventually asked to explain himself in an interview in the middle 20s, his answer was not especially eloquent and is all the better for it. He said in substance that he could not see what happiness a rich man got from contemplating a life of nothing but acquisition, followed by the cold legal distribution of his money after he was gone, and that he could no longer find any interest in simply accumulating more. It is worth measuring that against what the rest of American wealth was doing in the same generation. The great fortunes of the period were being turned into foundations too: libraries, universities, medical institutes, museums, and a good deal of magnificent public benefit came of it. But those were arrangements in which a family kept the company and endowed a charity alongside it. Hershey did the reverse. He gave away the company and kept a job. He had, by his own arrangement, no personal capital of consequence for the last 27 years of his life. He drew a salary. He lived in the mansion until 1930, when he moved out of it and gave it to the country club, and spent his last 15 years in a modest suite of rooms above the office of the school he had founded, with a view of the boys' farms. There is one further thing about the structure that is not sentimental at all, and which he plainly understood. A trust that owns the controlling votes of a company cannot be rated. No competitor can buy it. No heir can sell it in a weak moment. No board can be persuaded by a tender offer. The arrangement that gave a school an income also made the company permanently untakeable, which is why there is still a factory in that cornfield, and why, when the trust attempted to sell the company at the beginning of the 21st century, the courts and the state's attorney general stopped it. He had solved the problem of having no heir by inventing one that could not die. Meanwhile, there was the sugar. In the January of 1916, 10 months after his wife's death, Milton Hershey went to Cuba. He had gone, in the first instance, because he was grieving and had nowhere to be, and he fell in love with the place immediately. He described it afterwards as a country of eternal spring. And he also saw, with the part of his mind that never stopped working, that the war had wrecked the European beet sugar trade, and that Cuban cane was consequently the most important agricultural commodity in the Western Hemisphere. Within months, he had bought a small mill 60 miles east of Havana. Over the following decade, he bought more, and he built, on a plateau above the coast between Havana and the port of Matanzas, an entirely new sugar town, which he called Central Hershey, central being the Cuban word for a mill and the settlement around it. He built it the way he had built the one in Pennsylvania, which is to say he built the whole thing. Houses for the workers and their families, with gardens, a hotel, a general store, a hospital and clinics with doctors, nurses and dentists, a botanical garden, baseball fields. The company's team won a string of national amateur championships in the 30s. A golf course, a school which he furnished and then handed over to the community, exactly as he had done at home. And at another of his mills, he founded a school for Cuban orphan boys along the lines of the one in Derry Township, and ran it for a decade before turning it over to a local orphanage. And in 1922, he built a railway, an electric railway, the length of the sugar country, from Havana to Matanzas, so that the cane could reach the mills and the workers could live where they liked and travel in. Parts of it are still running. For most of a century, Cubans have called it the Hershey train, in a country in which almost nothing else retains an American name. Cuba gave him its highest civil decoration. He went back nearly every winter for the rest of his life. Now the other half of the ledger, because a documentary that stopped there would be an advertisement. Hershey's presence in Cuba was, by the standards of American business on that island in that period, unusually decent, and Cubans who remember it say so. It was also American business on that island in that period. He acquired something in the region of 60,000 acres and leased tens of thousands more, in a country whose entire economy was being reorganized around the requirements of buyers in the United States. Like the other American operators, he used seasonal migrant labor brought in from neighboring islands for the harvest, which had the effect, whether or not it was the intention, and it was certainly the effect, of holding down the wages available to Cuban cane cutters. And he was, throughout his life and in both countries, an implacable opponent of trade unions, on the sincere and entirely paternalist grounds that he had already given his people everything a union would ask for, and that the request itself was therefore a kind of insult. The sugar estates were sold in 1946, the year after he died. Central Hershey was renamed in 1959, after a Cuban revolutionary. The mill closed in the early 2000s. The train still runs badly. The crash came in the October of 1929, and for most of the next decade, the United States was a country in which roughly a quarter of the working population had nothing to do. The chocolate company was, by an accident of what it sold, almost perfectly insulated. A bar of chocolate cost 5 cents. In a depression, people who can no longer buy anything else go on buying the cheap thing that makes the day tolerable. The confectionery trade in the 1930s was one of the few industries in America that did not collapse, and Hershey's sales held. So he had money in a town full of men whose relatives in every other town in Pennsylvania were out of work, and he did the thing that seems obvious now and was almost unheard of then. He started building. It was called, afterwards, the Great Building Campaign, and it ran through the worst years of the Depression and employed around 600 men on construction at a time when construction had stopped everywhere else in the country. What they built is still standing and still in use. A community building with the theater inside it, whose auditorium was decorated as a Mediterranean courtyard under a night sky, with stars. A hotel on the hill above the town, a low, white Spanish Mediterranean thing that he had sketched out himself from postcards of places he had liked. A sports arena, roofed with a barrel shell of reinforced concrete, the first large structure of its kind in the United States. A stadium, a new building for the school, later named after his wife. There is a story attached to the hotel which is small and characteristic. The architects brought him the plans for the dining room, which was to be round, and there was a supporting column in the middle of it. He crossed it out. He had spent enough of his life in hotel dining rooms, he said, being seated behind a pillar where he could not see the room and the room could not see him, and no guest of his was going to have that table. The engineers had to redesign the roof. There is no column. And there is a better story than that, which comes out of the archive and which is the whole of the man in 3 words. He was standing at a site watching a steam shovel work. He asked how many men that machine was doing the work of, and was told about 40. He told them to get rid of the shovel and hire the 40 men. That is either the most humane instinct in American industrial history or an appalling way to run a construction project. And the honest answer is that it is both, and that he could afford it because his cheap product was recession-proof and that the men and their families ate that winter. There was a second motive behind all that construction, and he was open about it. A town that depends entirely on one factory is a town with one lung. He had watched what happened to the mill settlements of New England when the mills moved south, and he had no intention of leaving behind a place that could be closed by a single board decision in a room he would not be in. So the buildings of the 1930s were not only work relief, they were an attempt to give the town a second economy. It had begun almost by accident, decades earlier. In 1906, he had laid out a shaded picnic ground beside the creek for the use of factory employees on Sundays, with a bandstand and boats. People came from the surrounding counties to use it, and it acquired a carousel, and then rides, and then it stopped being a picnic ground. By the 1930s, the town had a park with an amusement ground and a zoo, a rose garden of several thousand bushes laid out where his wife's flowers had been moved, a golf course, a stadium, an arena that could hold an ice rink and a convention, a theater, a hotel, and a factory that had begun letting the public walk through and watch chocolate being made, which turned out to be one of the most effective pieces of marketing anybody in American food had yet devised. Visitors came in hundreds of thousands and then in millions. The advertising budget of the chocolate company for most of the 20th century was famously approximately nothing. The company did not run national advertisements until the 1970s on the theory that the product in the town sold themselves. The theory held. The amusement ground now takes several million visitors a year and employs a large part of the county, and the town survived the 20th century, which most single-industry towns in Pennsylvania did not. The valleys around it are full of places that made steel or coal or textiles and are now mainly notable for the buildings that are still standing empty. He built a tourist economy in a cornfield in the 1930s as insurance against a factory closure that has not yet happened, and it is the least discussed and possibly the shrewdest thing he ever did. He was in his middle 70s, he had given away his fortune, buried his wife and his mother, and built a hotel with no column in the dining room. And then, in the spring of 1937, the town turned over. The causes were not simple and were not mainly about him. Federal legislation in 1933 had regulated hours and wages across American industry. In Hershey, the effect was perverse. A workforce accustomed to a 60-hour week was cut to 40, which allowed the company to hire more people, which was the point of the law, but which meant that the individual pay package shrank at a moment when nobody had any margin. On top of that, there was a growing sense, particularly among younger men who had not been personally hired by the old man and did not know him, that the arrangement in that town gave a worker no standing of his own. Everything came as a gift. Nothing came as a right. In the January of 1937, a national union organized the factory, the first union it had ever had. Negotiations began and did not go well, and some of the men who had done the organizing were laid off. On the 2nd of April, the workers occupied the plant and sat down at their machines. It was the first sit-down strike in Pennsylvania, and it came weeks after the great automobile sit-down in Michigan that had electrified the whole labor movement. And unlike that one, it was not planned, not disciplined, and not led by anybody with experience. One historian has described it as feeling less like a revolution than like a family quarrel, which is exactly what made it dangerous. Because there were other people with an interest in that factory. The dairy farmers of the surrounding county sold their milk to Hershey and to nobody else, and the plant was shut, and milk does not wait. Within days, the countryside had a grievance of its own, and it was not with the company. On the 6th day, a crowd of dairy farmers and non-striking employees went into the building and drove the strikers out of it by force. Men were hurt. The strike ended that afternoon. There is a photograph of the old man, then 79, being led away from the works during the trouble, and the account given afterwards by the company's president was that it changed him permanently, that he was deeply and simply hurt and could not understand how everything he had done for the town had come to this. That reaction is worth examining rather than sympathizing with, because it is the diagnostic fact about the entire model. A man who gives you a park, a school, a swimming pool, and a hospital, and is genuinely wounded when you ask for a contract, has not understood what you were asking for. You were not asking for more. You are asking for the arrangement to survive him. And the tragedy, the real one, underneath the sentimentality that surrounds this town, is that he of all people should have understood that, because it was precisely the problem he had solved for the school 19 years earlier and had never thought to solve for the workforce. The company signed an agreement with a different union later that year and became one of the first candy manufacturers in America to be organized. The town did not fully recover its temper for a generation. Families stopped speaking to each other. Some never resumed. The last years were quiet. He had moved out of the mansion in 1930 and lived in a small apartment above the school's administration offices, from which he could see the boys' farms. He ate in the hotel dining room, at a table like everyone else's. He walked the streets and the factory floor almost daily into his 80s, and was known to every child in the place, and gave away a great deal of chocolate personally. His mother had died in 1920. His father, the man of schemes, had died in 1904, having lived long enough to see the factory in the cornfield begin. Old Levy, who had put in his savings in 1886 and stayed 40 years, had died in 1939. The war changed the factory more than the Depression had. 2 years before it reached the United States, an Army officer had come to Hershey with a specification for a survival ration. It had to weigh about 4 ounces, deliver 600 calories, withstand temperatures that would reduce ordinary chocolate to liquid, and the requirement that has passed into legend because it was written down in exactly these terms: taste a little better than a boiled potato. The Army did not want a treat. It wanted an emergency food that a hungry soldier would not eat until he was actually in an emergency. The company's chief chemist produced it. The result was hard enough that it had to be shaved with a knife or gnawed, unpleasant enough to fulfill the specification exactly, and stable in the heat of the Pacific. It went ashore in North Africa and at Normandy and across the islands, and the men who carried it despised it with a thoroughness that survives in the memoirs of that generation, and it kept an unknown number of them alive. The factory turned out these bars by the hundreds of millions. At the height of the production, the plant was running at a scale it had never approached in peacetime, largely staffed, as every American factory was in those years, by women on shifts in a town whose young men were gone. There is a photograph from the period of the old man, then in his middle 80s, inspecting a line of ration bars with an Army officer. He had been born 4 years before the American Civil War, in a house lit by candles, in a family that spoke German. He lived to see a chocolate bar made in his own factory carried up a beach in Normandy. The company received the Army's production award repeatedly. He was quietly proud of it in a way he had not been proud of anything commercial in years, and it is not hard to see why. It was the first time the product had been unambiguously useful. He died on the 13th of October, 1945, in the town he had built, 5 weeks after his 88th birthday and 5 weeks after the war ended. He was buried in the cemetery on the hill, beside his wife and his parents. He left personally almost nothing, because there was nothing left to leave. He had signed it all away 27 years earlier and had told no one at the time. So the question, 80 years on, is what the arrangement actually produced. And the answer has to be given in 2 parts, because an endowment that runs for more than a century stops being a gesture and becomes an institution. And institutions behave differently from the people who found them. The first part is the straightforward one. The school works. It began with 4 boys in a farmhouse in 1910. It now occupies several thousand acres, teaches something like 2,000 children at a time from kindergarten to the end of secondary school, houses them in family-sized groups with married couples as house parents in the manner Milton Hershey laid out, and charges nothing. Not reduced fees, nothing. Tuition, housing, food, clothing, medical and dental care, and a scholarship afterwards. Something over 12,000 children have come through it. Almost all of them arrived from circumstances in which none of the above was otherwise going to happen. The founding terms have been changed twice in ways that were necessary and are not comfortable to describe. The original deed specified white boys, and this was written in 1909 in the plain assumption of the period, and it stood for 60 years. The first students of color were enrolled in the August of 1968, and every reference to race was struck out of the deed at the end of 1970. In the November of 1976, the deed was restated again, to admit girls and to admit children who had living parents but no functioning family. The phrase used was social orphans, since the actual orphan, in the strict 19th century sense of a child with no parents at all, had become a rarity in America. The first 8 girls arrived in the spring of 1977. It is worth saying plainly, the school as it now exists could not have been founded on the terms of the document that founded it. That is not a reason to sneer at the document. It is what happens to any instrument written in 1909 that is still operating in the 21st century, and the alternative, an endowment that could not be amended at all, would simply have frozen the prejudices of that year in place forever. The second part is less flattering, and it belongs in this account. The trust that owns the school now also still owns the controlling votes of the chocolate company, and it has grown into one of the largest endowments attached to any school anywhere in the world, in the region of $16 billion, which is more than most universities and vastly more than any secondary school on earth. And for a long time it has been argued, by the school's own alumni association, by state investigators and by journalists, that an institution sitting on that much money and educating 2,000 children is not doing what its founder had in mind. The defense offered is the deed itself, which permits the managers to spend only the income of the endowment and never to touch the principal, precisely so that the thing would last in perpetuity. The criticism is that the income has grown so enormously that this restriction has stopped being prudence and become hoarding, and that the annual proportion actually spent has run well below what a charitable institution would ordinarily distribute, and that unspent income has accumulated in the billions while children who would qualify were turned away. There have been investigations, agreements with the state's attorney general, agreements rescinded, litigation over who is standing to complain, and a long-running argument about the conduct of the trustees. And in 2002, when the trustees proposed selling the controlling stake in the chocolate company in order to diversify their assets, which is exactly what any competent modern fiduciary would advise, the state went to court and a judge granted an injunction stopping them, and the town, which understood precisely what was being proposed, came out into the streets to object. The founder had built a structure that could not be raided from outside. He had not entirely foreseen that it could be argued with from inside. None of this alters the central fact, which is simply that the money is still there and the children are still being taught, 116 years after 2 people signed a piece of paper about a farm. Which charitable intentions do not survive their author by a decade. There is a comparison worth making, because this channel has spent a good deal of time on the other men who were rich in America at the same moment. The great fortunes of the age between the 1870s and the 1920s nearly all ended in philanthropy of some kind. The steel fortune built libraries in a couple of thousand towns, in a concert hall, and an institution for peace. The oil fortune built a university, a medical institute, and a foundation that eradicated diseases. Those were larger gifts than this one, and they did more measurable good in the world. And they were made by men who had spent decades doing things that no amount of endowment quite balances. But every one of those men kept the company. The libraries were funded out of the interest on a fortune that remained, at the end, a family's property. The name went on the building, and the ownership stayed in the house. Milton Hershey did the arithmetic in the other direction, and did it in his own lifetime, at 61 in secret, and then went on turning up at the office for 27 years as an employee of an institution he no longer owned. It is not a larger gift than the others. It is a stranger one, and a more complete one, and it is the only one of them that was made without an audience. It is worth ending on the boys, because they are the only part of this that was ever the point. They are not anonymous. Something over 12,000 of them have come out of that school, and they became what such children become when somebody feeds and teaches them: mechanics, farmers, soldiers, teachers, doctors, businessmen, a chief executive or two, a great many entirely ordinary men and women who raised families in Pennsylvania and elsewhere and did not make the newspapers. That is not a modest outcome. That is the outcome. The measure of an institution like that one is not the exceptional graduate, but the median one. And the median one had a life that would not otherwise have been available. The Alumni Association formed in 1930 at the founder's own instruction, and it is worth noticing that when that association came to believe, 60 years later, that the trust was sitting on money, it ought to be spending on children. It was the graduates themselves who went to the state and demanded an investigation. He built the school. He also, without meaning to, built the constituency that would eventually hold it to account. There are worse epitaphs, and there is a plain fact about the last 15 years of his life that no amount of retelling has managed to make sentimental because it is too plain. A man who had built one of the most profitable manufacturing businesses in the United States and had given the whole of it away, chose to spend his final years in a small set of rooms above the offices of a school for other people's children, with a window that looked out over the farms those children worked before breakfast. He could have lived anywhere on earth. He picked the room with that view. The town is still there. Some 14,000 people live in it. The factory is still on Chocolate Avenue, and the school still owns the company that owns it. The theater with the painted stars still puts on shows. The hotel on the hill still has a round dining room with no column in the middle of it. And the story about why is told to every guest who asks. The arena is still standing. The trolley is long gone, which is a pity. The amusement ground that began as a picnic grove for factory employees now takes several million visitors a year. And on summer evenings, you can hear it from most of the town. The street lamps are still shaped like wrapped sweets. Half of them are wrapped and half are unwrapped, in alternation, which is the sort of detail that could only have been decided by somebody who cared far too much. And in the cemetery on the hill above all of it, there is a plain gray monument with the name of a man who finished the 4th grade and failed at 3 businesses, and beside it the name of an Irish shop girl from Jamestown, New York, who was ill for most of her married life, who died at 43 asking for a glass of champagne, and who, according to the only person who ever knew for certain, and who said it publicly for 30 years afterwards, thought of the school first. They had wanted a family. What they got instead was several thousand acres of Pennsylvania, a factory, a town, an endowment that has outlasted every fortune made in their generation, and 12,000 children, none of whom were theirs and all of whom were. Some fortunes, in the end, are remembered less for the families they founded than for the family they were built to replace.